Welcome everyone to the National Alliance of Preservation Commission's latest podcast forum webinar, Design Review with Limited Resources, Working Without Professional Preservation Staff. I'm Robin Zeigler, and my co-host here is Chris Wand, and we'll be serving as the moderators for this discussion. I'd like to take a few moments to get everyone oriented to this particular webinar platform. Like other platforms, you have access to the Q&A, chat, and polling functions, which are tabs at the top right of your screen. And if you'd like to minimize those, just click the downward arrow at the upper right corner. And then to bring them back up, there's a blue chat button at the bottom right corner. And then to view today's presentation in full screen mode, you can just hover over presentation and click full. If you experience any technical issues, just use the private chat function to send a message to NAPC. The session is being recorded, and so it'll be available for on-demand viewing for about 60 days afterwards, and you'll get that shortly after we complete today. And a few more housekeeping items. Chris, if you want to take over.
Yeah, on your screen are instructions for continuing education credits if you need them. You can also find these instructions repeated throughout the presentation in the chat tab, which is up on the upper right. We will take questions as we go, and we will get to them as time allows. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function. If someone else asks a question you'd like to hear an answer to as well, give their question a thumbs up or up vote, and it will move toward the top of the list. We're hopeful that we'll have a little time at the end for you to share your ideas with us regarding how you have managed without staff. So be thinking of that as we go through the presentation.
Thanks. And then NAPC is committed to providing a welcoming space that encourages collaboration, discussion, and the sharing of ideas and points of view. So note that by attending, you agree to the code of conduct on this screen. So let's take a little time to get to know each other. I'm going to open up a poll here so we can learn a little bit about you. And while you are doing that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me to start with. I'm Robin Zeigler. I'm staff to the Design Review Commission here in Nashville, Tennessee. We're a little different than most because we are a standalone department. We're not a part of planning or community development. And we actually have two commissions that we serve. I mainly work with the Design Review Commission, but then there's also the another commission that deals mostly with outreach and education. And I have really been involved with NAPC since the beginning. And I'm a camp trainer, commissioner assistance and mentoring program, which is NAPC's main educational component. And I'm a former board member. And that's actually how Chris and I first met and became partners in crime and discovered a mutual love of mid-century. Chris, tell them a little bit about you.
Yeah, as Robin said, my name is Chris Wand. I'm an architect. I live in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I sat on a historic preservation commission for 11 years prior to moving to Cedar Rapids. And I'm also a former NAPC board member, as Robin mentioned. I'm also a camp trainer. I participate in a handful of those each year. So you may see me in your area at some point as I travel around the country. While I give a brief intro to our speakers, be sure to fill out that poll if you haven't done so already. So joining us today are four experts in their respective fields and specifically on the topic of today's webinar. Mindy Crawford is the Executive Director of Preservation Pennsylvania, which is the statewide advocacy organization and the historic preservation consultant for the Borough of Mercersburg Historic and Architectural Review Board. She also serves as the treasurer for the National Alliance of Preservation Commission's Board of Directors. Also joining us is Sarah Korjeff. She works as a historic preservation specialist and planner for the Cape Cod Commission, a regional planning and regulatory agency in Barnstable County, Massachusetts. She is a primary author of the Commission's Cultural Heritage and Community Design Guideline document, and she has led planning efforts in several towns and historic districts in the region and provides training to those communities as well. Sarah holds a master's degree in historic preservation from the University of Pennsylvania. Next, we'll have Tim Leahy, who is chair of the Annapolis Historic Preservation Commission and board chair of the Chesapeake Crossroads Heritage Area, as well as an active volunteer with several local nonprofits. His professional background includes 40 years of experience in various technology-related roles, and he is a proud graduate of the University of Virginia, where he received his BS in architecture in 1976 and his MBA in 1979. Finally, we'll hear from Laura Renwick. She is the Community Preservation Specialist for the Southern Regional Office of Indiana Landmarks, the statewide preservation nonprofit. A primary job responsibility is working with local preservation commissions through Indiana Landmarks Community Assistance Program.
Thank
so
you.
With that, we'll go back to the poll. Go, Robin.
Yes. And this is really interesting because 36% are our staff to a commission, which I didn't really expect to be here today. So welcome, staff. Go, staff. I'm staff. And then we've got 33% commissioner, 40% volunteer, and 42% other. So let me run over here and see what other might be. Okay, regional planner, great. Oh, hi, Joe. Oh, now I sound like I'm doing a TikTok live. Hey. Well, there's so many answers, I can't get to them all. So in a minute, we're going to ditch the PowerPoint, but not just yet, because we are going to dive into a discussion on, change it there, and perhaps even a debate with our NAPC friends who are with us about dealing with commissions that don't have staff. And again, don't hesitate to go ahead, excuse me, and enter your questions in the chat and even your ideas on how you have worked without staff, whether they worked or didn't work, because those fails are, a big learner too. So since we're here to talk about how to manage without professional preservation staff, let's define that a little bit. Typically, that's someone who works full-time, but at least even if they're part-time, they're really a resource to their commission. So they're writing reports, they're providing an analysis of projects based on the guidelines, they're doing research for a commission, maybe even using the NAPC listserv to ask questions of others, and they're providing assistance to applicants, which I think is really important. They're helping applicants with their applications, making sure they're complete, making sure that if there's little things they could tweak to get a yes, that's being done, and how the procedures work. And I think that really provides some good customer service. So I'm going to run another little poll. This is our last one, just to learn a little bit more about who you all are. And while I do that, I'll let you know what I think is important about this. So now again, I'm staff to commission, but Chris and I are also CAMP trainers. And again, CAMP is the Commissioner Assistance and Mentoring Program. And in doing those, I feel like, Chris, I'm speaking for you two here. This is true. I'm sure this is true. We've really learned so much traveling the country and seeing all these different commissions, and they all work a little differently, and their guidelines are all a little different. Their laws are all a little different. Their state laws are a little different. And so we've learned so much. And one of the things we really picked up on is this issue of how do you manage without staff? So NAPC started doing some research on what options were available, like the ones you're going to hear about today. And for this session, we'll be talking mainly about the front end type of support and not inspections and enforcement, because that's really another topic of its own. But we put together a document with the same name as this webinar, and it's available on NAP's website, and it's available on the handouts tab. So let me run back to the poll. 73% don't have professional staff. I think that's what we expected. 7% don't have a commissioner board yet, so welcome. I hope this will be helpful to you. 15% not sure, and 30% are involved in some other way with a commission. Close that. Now, just a little disclaimer. Don't instigate anything. Don't instigate any of these scenarios without first checking your state and local ordinances to make sure these ideas align with your local and state rules. Your SHPO's office, your State Historic Preservation Office really should be your first step, and you should also check with your city's legal counsel. Now I'm going to turn this, or Marie's going to turn off the PowerPoint for me so we can just all sit back and relax and chat a little bit. And again, we'll take questions and ideas as we go. And I'll start with what I think is the best first suggestion. This is going to sound like an advert, but I really think being a member of NAPC is important. And here's why. I got involved with NAPC at the very beginning of my career. And I didn't know anything. I really didn't know anything. and they were such a huge help. And I like to think now, after a few years, I know a little something, but I still use NAPC constantly in the work I do. Articles in the Alliance Review are so helpful. Those are things I can pass on to my commissioners. I use the listserv all the time to kind of, something will come up that was unexpected and we're not quite sure how to handle. We'll just see how everyone else is handling it before we reinvent the wheel. And then the connections that we all make at the biennial conference. And again, I think Chris will agree, in addition to the sessions and the connections, there's just sort of this re-energizing feeling when you attend the conference and you come back to your community, you're just really ready to try some new things. So I think that's important. And then second is, I think the greatest advantage of professional preservation staff is that we as staff can provide advice, again, that helps them get approval that first time. So of course, my first thought is, how does a commission do that if they don't have the staff to help with that? And one option might be through some type of pre-review session where the applicant obtains feedback from the commission. And I'll say that it seems to be so useful that even commissions that do have professional preservation staff, like Little Rock, Arkansas, and Salt Lake City, Utah, have used this, or used to anyway. And then Tim, I'll pull you in here because I know Annapolis has had some great success with this. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works for you guys?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Yeah, and we do have professional staff full-time, and we use a what we call a pre-application procedure when it's important, when an application is relatively complicated. So it doesn't happen in every single case, but our process is an applicant will always be in contact with the staff person, who is great. So I plug, if you can get support for a staff person, a dedicated staff person, if you can, is worth it. They are the public outreach and first point of contact. If it is relatively undeveloped or complex, he may recommend that the person come to a hearing. We have 2 hearings a month, and a pre-application process can come to any of them. And we ask the applicant to prepare drawings, a packet that is relatively detailed and relatively developed, so we can provide feedback. And it's the whole commission meets. It usually is at the end. Sometimes, usually if we have a heavy agenda, you do have to wait around a little bit. So it's at the end of the meeting. And it's a give and take. It's a free-flowing discussion. It is in our rules of procedure. So it's more or less, it's a little bit formalized or official that we do it. The public can also attend, which...
Now, do you open the public hearing when they're there? When the public's there?
No, we don't need to. It's not considered a public hearing. So it is done mainly as a convenience to the applicant. And we go around the table. Staff can provide their comments. Each of the commissioners can provide comments, and we train. A side benefit is we have different types of applicants, very sophisticated applicants who've been to us many times, and they want to engage usually in a higher level of discussion. They want to effectively see what will fly, and we would say that's not feasible. So and then there's the people who may never have been to us before, and it's a completely new experience to them, and sometimes the public hearing can be a little intimidating. And so it provides us an ability for the applicant to get to know us and let them know we're here to get to a yes with you, and we want to work with you. So it provides that icebreaker.
I hadn't thought of it that way before, because it is really intimidating to be in that room and have you all up in front of everybody. So kind of having that tester meeting probably is really helpful, makes people feel a lot more comfortable. And I'll tell you the other thing I really like about your system is that it's the entire commission. The one I'm most familiar with was a committee of the commission, often just one commissioner. And so an applicant would go and sit down with that one commissioner. They'd get feedback. They'd be like, okay, great. I'll just implement all of this. And then I'll have a yes. And then they go before the full commission and they're not having it. So I think it is
Right.
helpful that it's it's at the end of your regular meeting like that.
Yeah, that's very important. You don't want to give false hope ever to an applicant or give the opposite. Um, and
Yeah.
and we are still doing this virtually. But what's really great about when we do it in person, we do come down. We we meet in City Hall, City Council chambers. So we're kind of up on this podium. We always go down and meet at a conference table.
Oh, that's even better.
Yeah.
For the pre-app, it changes the tone, and to the point where I'm thinking we should always meet that way anyway. But
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
Tim, a couple of questions. You talked earlier about kind of the level of detail of some of the drawings and other information you get for those work sessions. Is there a minimum level of detail that you have to have in order to have the work session, or can someone come in when they're contemplating the project just to even get kind of a feel for what the commission's position would be?
That's progressed over time. It's become very popular to be used. So by now, at first it was just possibly thoughts and some sketches maybe, but now people are coming in with I don't know, 50% or 60% of not their full application, but we have a lot to look at and a lot to provide feedback on.
And who does the notifications for that work session? Is that something that staff takes care of for you? And I guess kind of getting back to the point of the session overall, I mean, if you don't have staff, how would that potentially be handled?
Yeah. Well, since we do have staff, we're lucky it's all handled. It is part of the formal agenda. So we have a formal agenda for every public hearing. So whoever prepares your agendas for the public hearing can place it on there. And it's somewhat flexible in that it can be added within, we like to notify the public of anything at least 3 days in advance. And that goes out to a mailing list. The agenda changes go out to a mailing list handled by City Hall.
So for those who don't have that professional preservation staff, there's still probably some city staff person somewhere that takes care of those general notices for all the different commissions, boards and commissions.
I would think so.
And Patricia wants to know, are you the final word, or does your recommendation go to City Council for final approval?
No, our commission, we approve a certificate of approval, and so we're the final word.
That's helpful.
Yes. And we have a very strong ordinance actually, and I know not everyone does, but we are a quasi judicial, so it is our word truly is final. And the meetings, our decisions are made in the meetings. Some commissions or some boards operate that there might be a discussion afterward and more deliberation and then a ruling. But our meetings, the decisions are made at the meeting and they're done.
Have there been any drawbacks? I mean, it sounds like it's all working really well.
I consider it really a positive thing. You touched on one potential drawback, that if not all the commissioners are present, we have great attendance too, so we're pretty lucky. But it can be managed. But we don't want to give false hope or false negatives. So you need to make sure that you're telling the honest truth when you see a proposal. If it's not feasible, we need to make sure we work to make changes. So you don't want to give false hope. So we haven't had a situation yet where the applicant gets to the final hearing and it's a completely different story.
Yeah.
Another positive that I'll mention is that by the time they do get to the final application, we've seen the application possibly 2 or even 3 times. So the final application meeting goes very quickly. In fact, we can use something called a consent docket. So it makes the final approval actually go quite quickly.
I'm a huge fan of that. I think that helps a lot when you have a lot of cases to have that consent agenda where everything's kind of approved all at one time without a lot of discussion, without public input, assuming no one wants to take it off. And anyone usually can, a commissioner or a member of the public. And before we let you go, and we're going to move on and talk about consultants in a minute, but how many commission members on your commission, and is there an appeal process?
We have 7, and we're on rotating 3-year cycles. And the appeal process is to the state court. So it goes right to the top. So when we were very happy. Well, it helps the seriousness of the application, and it moves things forward quickly, which is great.
And I'd lied. There's one more question. Barbara pointed out that you must have a very generous conference room to fit all these people, the commissioners and the staff. I mean, the public and the applicant. But can you meet at a different time? I know you have yours during your, or at the end of your regular agenda, but you could meet at a different time, right? And just notice that.
Actually, we don't do that. We have, first of all, we can use City Hall chambers for all of our meetings, so it's plenty big, and of course Zoom has changed all that too. But we like to keep all of our business in our 2 monthly meetings. So we have a public hearing and an administrative meeting every month. So we don't ever, unless there's an emergency, meet outside that schedule. So that's, again, but we publish that at the beginning of the year.
And there are a couple more questions, but I'm going to hold on to them.
Okay.
And we might come back to them a little bit later.
Okay.
But I know, Chris, you had some questions for Mindy.
Yeah, so thanks, Tim. What you've outlined obviously is a great way for applicants to obtain assistance, but preservation staff, professional preservation staff, also provide a really valuable service to commissioners. Having some type of consultant is a great answer when full-time staff is not a reality. Consultants might provide ongoing services for your regularly scheduled meetings, or on an as-needed basis for difficult or controversial issues. They could be a private consultant or a nonprofit partner. Mindy, tell us a little bit about what you do and how your nonprofit provides consultant services.
Yes, we do, as the nonprofit advocacy organization, we do limited fee for service. And I have to admit that I've been the historic preservation consultant for Mercersburg Borough for 25 years. Previously with Historic York, nobody wanted the job. And so I brought it with me to Preservation Pennsylvania. So I have a long relationship with them. They're a tiny borough. They only have 2 staff. They have a borough manager and an assistant borough manager. And they act as the zoning officer. It is very tiny. They do have a historic architectural review board, which is our state version of a historic district commission, and they are a certified local government. So they are great at compliance, but there is no way that they could provide staff. So they have I have a contract with them based on hours. I try to be very cognizant of their tiny budget, and I don't go to the meetings unless there's something controversial. I do my reviews ahead of time. They accept the application. They provide me with the application, any materials that are submitted with it. They also very kindly go out and take photographs for me so that I can do the reviews for the most part, just, in my office and send it to them in advance. If it's something complicated, I will go to the meetings, but I usually let them decide if they want me there, again, because I want to be respectful of their budgets. They can also call on me for when there's a big project that is in the design phase and they want to talk through all of the different ideas. I'm doing that right now with a large building on the square that has been, as far as I know, in my whole time there, has never really been fully occupied and had just one tenant after another. This is going to be a major change for them, and that's required a number of different visits. But it works well for them because they can stay within their budget and they still feel that they have someone they can blame from outside when there's a recommendation to deny something.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
It's a small community. Everybody knows everybody. When you come as an applicant, you probably personally know everyone who's on the commission. So it is easy to say, well, the consultant says that this doesn't meet the Secretary of the Interior standards or the Mercersburg guidelines. When I started, they didn't have guidelines. They were just using the Secretary of the Interior standards. So I helped them get a CLG grant so that they could get their own set of guidelines, which now they use those.
So how do you advise commissions like when their decisions don't necessarily align with your recommendations?
Well, I've always been that when I first started, there was a lot of comments about something not being cute, or, oh, I remember when that building used to look better. And so we did a little bit of training and taught them that they were not supposed to express their opinions about cute or ugly, or and you know, they still struggle with it a little bit, but I remind them about precedent setting and say, you know, if you are going to go against my recommendation and you're going to choose to allow them to put in, I'm going to say vinyl windows, but honestly, this commission has never allowed a vinyl window to go in. It's pretty incredible. But anyway, if they're going to go against my recommendation that something does or doesn't meet the standards, I make sure that their motion says that they are voting to approve it and are not following the recommendations of the consultant. So that if the next person comes in and says, well, you let them do it, you know, they've already been very clear that they recognize that they're going against the recommendations, and also that they give the reasons why, not just because they like the person or because they were, you know, that they're being very clear that we are making this decision based on whatever the circumstances are as to why they're going against the recommendation. And it has worked very well. They've only had one appeal through the district justice system, which is how that works here in Pennsylvania, in all the years that I've been their consultant.
And how many years did you say that was?
I think it's about 25. The biggest challenge there has been when borough council changes, because you know, in all the time that I've been doing this, they've had mostly supportive borough councils. But there have been a few times where there's probably a period of about 2 years where if you showed up as a citizen and you didn't like what the HARB said, the city council would just overturn it. Sometimes they would just overturn things they didn't like. It was a real dark time for a little while, but thankfully, you know, a lot of those people got voted out, and they've been, the borough is very proud of their history, and they have worked really hard to keep it that way. They had a district very early, 1970.
So I have one question before we get to a couple that have popped up in the Q&A. With it being a small community and everybody knows everybody, I mean, we all run into this on our local commissions as well. We just, you know, applicants come in, you just know them, you run into them at the grocery store. As an outside consultant, do you find that that's a hurdle ever for you, just not knowing the community or living in the community?
I think it would be difficult for a new person. I've spent a lot of time in the community because I did the design guidelines and helped them with some signage guidelines. And so I feel very comfortable with the community. In fact, it's to the point now where I actually already know what the building looks like when I see the applicant, because they only do maybe 12 to 20 applications a year. So a meeting generally has one application. And it's to the point now where I've written reviews for the same building probably 10 times when the tenant changes and they want a new sign, because they don't have any kind of staff review because they have no one that feels comfortable doing it. So it's they now know me, that for the most part. Actually, the last time I went there, I got a speeding ticket. So, and I didn't get off either. So, you know, it doesn't matter. They knew who I was, and they said, well, you know better. When you come to town, you need to follow the speed limit.
So a couple of questions have come in. Dawn was asking, does the community then charge the applicant additional hourly time if you have to make excessive site visits?
No, the borough just has that in their budget. They plan on their budget for this line item assumes that I will probably be making, you know, X number of trips. But no, they don't charge the applicant.
Okay, and a question came up about where this is located, and it's in, is it Pennsylvania, right?
Yes, mm-hmm.
Yep.
Franklin County, Pennsylvania, sort of the south central part of the state.
Okay. Another question that came in from Alex, how best can a city approach registering historic properties not currently on a registry, especially when they don't have staff? Is that something you handle for them? Well,
when I started, they had a local review district and a national registry district that had identical boundaries. They have talked a couple of times about expanding their national register district, but they have never had the funds to do it. So it has, you know, they've considered applying for a CLG grant, but for them, the match money is really difficult for them to get.
There aren't any other questions. Robin, do you have anything that you wanted to ask as a follow-up?
Well, I think most of my questions might be for how it works for Laura. So I'm going to pull you in because I know you're a consultant of a type as well, but that's for Indiana Landmarks, the statewide nonprofit. And I know that your program is one that I'm very envious of. I'm sure most states are very envious of. If they're not already, they will be when they hear from you. How does this all work?
Yeah, thank you. It sounds like it's similar to Mindy's program in a lot of ways, but maybe on a little bit of a larger scale. And we actually have been doing this for quite a while. The program, which we call the Community Assistance Program, has been in place for over 25 years. So Indiana Landmarks is the statewide nonprofit, and we are fortunate to have 9 regional offices around the state, as well as our headquarters in Indianapolis. And so we already kind of have a network of locations and trained staff in place around the state. And so we are able to contract with different municipalities to provide staff services like developing guidelines, conducting training, preparing meeting materials, those types of things. And so we do it on a contractual basis. I work with 4 different communities in South Central Indiana, ranging in population from about 3,000 to about 50,000. And so these are all smaller communities that most likely would not be in a position to hire a professional preservation planner, or some of them don't have any kind of planning staff whatsoever.
And may never, right? I mean, they're just small enough, they may never have that.
Right. So yeah, it has worked out very well. And we try to keep it as affordable as possible for the communities as well. For my communities, it's ranging from about $2,500 per year to about $7,500 a year, kind of depending on the workload and the budget that the community might have available.
I have a question that's really for you and for Mindy. As a local government employee, sometimes, rarely, but sometimes politics come into how I write a staff recommendation, right? I might be kind of told what direction to take with that. Or do you feel like you're a little immune from that because you're not technically working for the city?
Yes, I would say in a sense it does give us we're a little bit more of a neutral third party than necessarily a city employee might be. On the other hand, there's also kind of the balance between you've got this contractual relationship with the city and you don't want to necessarily alienate them or
right.
So it is a little bit of a balance there. My predecessor in this position had a situation where they advocated for something a little bit too strongly, and we lost that contract with that city. So it's.
Then what happened? Did they hire someone, or did they just not have help?
They went for several years without any kind of staff support for their review board, but then they eventually have hired a person to fill that position at the city level.
Still kind of a fine line you're doing
Yes.
there. And then you mentioned advocacy, and again, both of you are working with organizations that have an advocacy component, but then here you are taking on this role of writing recommendations for the city. Has there been any kind of push and pull between those two things, or has the greater organization kind of told you what direction to head, or maybe it's not an issue at all?
I don't know if Mindy has a different perspective, but I have not found that to really be a huge issue with my works so far.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the municipality likes that we are the statewide advocacy organization. it sort of makes them feel like they're getting advice from someone who knows what's going on across the state. And what they've done, they've been really helpful to me when we were advocating for our state tax credit, because they have so many buildings that would have been able to use it. And so they actually jumped in and got involved a little bit in advocating for the state tax credit.
Now I've got a question that came through from Jessica Zeigler. She has the last name as me, and she even spells it like I do. How about that? We both spell it wrong, I think. I work as a preservation architect and have served on my local historical commission. Both from the inside and outside of the review process, I've found potential applicants are usually clueless about the process and are resentful that the review agency will prevent them from doing what they want with their properties. For larger communities where you may not know everyone, how do you effectively communicate submission requirements for reviews, as well as the realistic reach of the review board and the level of flexibility in working with property owners to find solutions? And anyone could take that, really.
Well, that rings true for me, so I'll jump in. Since our historic district is contiguous, the boundaries are pretty well known, and every property in the historic district is responsible for submitting any exterior changes, and the other thing is only exterior. So when a person purchases a home, or a landowner, a landlord, commercial property is purchased, they're pretty aware, at least, that there's a process. We do have to do frequent updates, frequent publications. So ask first is what we kind of say. So a little bit of public relations, and so that works sometimes. And then as to they don't understand why they can't do what they want, we do go through, I think this is mainly the job of staff, and it's one of the greatest benefits of staff. Staff explains the fact that the town passed these ordinances 30 years ago because we wanted to maintain the commercial and historical aspects of the town, and that's why you have chosen to live here. So there's a little bit of public relations that goes on with staff, and again, that is one of the great things that happens in the first meeting, and the staff usually ends up dealing with most of that initial reaction. By the time they get to the commission, that usually is not an issue.
And I will mention that one of the things that I do, it's not something that's in the contract or anything like that, but I try to stay on top of when properties change hands. I send a welcome letter, or when a property is listed with a realtor, I try to reach out and make sure that the realtor is aware that it's in a historic district, and encourage them to convey that to potential buyers, and just kind of bridge the gap at the front end there. And
how do you find out when a property has changed hands?
I just stay on top of the GIS records. Fortunately, all of our counties have that online that I work in. And so I'm able to just kind of keep an eye on it.
And I don't know, this may be old school because this was a long time ago, but I used to have I think it was the utility company would send me a list every month of those properties that are in an overlay that had new service. And so some of them may not have changed hands, it was just the name on, but still, it was still a reminder for people that they were in the district. Another thing that we do here is that we all of the departments that deal with permitting, we're all using the same system. And so all of the properties that are in an overlay have a flag on them. So if someone goes down to codes and they start a building permit, they can't finish that until they get a preservation permit or certificate of appropriateness from us. So that kind of stops them and lets them know. And then, of course, our website is chock full of a lot of information.
Yeah, so the commission that I was on, before you go to the next question, Robin, the commission I was on in Dubuque, Iowa, we had actually worked with the local community to get kind of the deeds to actually list that the property was in a historic district, so that anytime anybody was looking at a property, they would find out from the deed that there's a restriction on there. And just coming from the architect perspective, there are a lot of people that can't afford to hire an architect to do their design work for their renovation projects. But if they do, I think one of the things that we can all be better about is educating the design professionals on what the restrictions are and how to go through the process, so that if they are involved, they can help us educate those clients for us. I'm not a preservation architect. I don't do a lot of preservation, but I'm highly interested in it. But I know enough about it that if anybody comes to me with a project that has that component, I know what to say to them about how to get through that process.
And Orloff added that newsletters targeting historic district landowners can keep community morale high. And I'd even add to that, staying in touch with those neighborhood organizations and giving them information to add to their newsletters, which may be what he's saying too, can help just continuously. It's not a one-time thing, right? It's continuously, we've got to be letting people know about it.
Yeah, leveraging your local neighborhood association is super important. And Robin, I did want to follow up. All of our permits are going through the same system, so there are checks and balances. And that what you mentioned may seem simple, but if that doesn't exist, then all of a sudden somebody gets something sprung on them at maybe the last minute. They're ready to get the permit, and they didn't realize they needed another approval. So we have a nice flow that is useful to put in place. Okay.
Tim, while you're still here, because I know you're going to leave us a little early, I'm going to jump back and ask this question. What is the difference between your administration meeting and the meeting for applicants?
The public hearing is when the bulk of actual applications and certificates are heard. So it's a bit more formal and has a very deep, the agenda is specific to each application. We can do other business as well, and we can hear pre-apps. The administrative meeting can be used for pretty much at the discretion of the commission. Sometimes we can hear applications if it's urgent, but for the most part, we discuss other business. We do a bit of training. We talk about what might be going on in other departments in the city. Possibly the planning commission information might be shared. So we have a lot of freedom with that agenda. We can also talk about violations or potential changes in guidelines that we might be introducing. So it's much more flexible.
That's handy, because I feel sometimes like we're a little constrained and we're just really there to talk about the cases, and we don't get that time to talk about those other things.
Yeah, we have a good discretion, and we use it to hopefully anyone who's going to be watching might also learn what's on the commission's mind and what we're getting from other departments. Even environmental issues come up in the planning process.
And continuing that discussion about how do you keep people informed, we have someone who says, excuse me, we're currently working on a welcome letter that informs people of the Historic Preservation Overlay District in the process of getting approval for a change. Everyone who buys into the district knows that they'll be limited on what they can do before they buy the property, which is very, very helpful.
Robin, I was going to jump in and say that some communities in our area do the same thing. They try to keep track of regularly sending out messages to property owners within historic areas. And in addition to that, I think we've seen some real success working with local press. So your local newspaper, or even your local historical society that maybe has a publication. And that's been a nice way of helping to make sure that people in your community, even beyond the folks who live within the boundaries of a historic district, know about the significance of historic properties and just are made a little bit more aware.
And this next question, I think, is a really good one. Many commissions in my county don't meet when there's not an application. Of course, why would they need to? So how can you keep that momentum going when there's not a lot of activity? Any thoughts from anyone?
I would say jump into the planning side of your job, right? Most of these boards spend a lot of time reviewing specific projects, but there's a real benefit to stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. Are there any parts of your community where you should be inventorying more historic properties, or considering creating a larger or a new historic district, or even just doing some kind of interpretation and educational campaign?
Yeah, I was going to say, is there training that you could provide? Because that kind of dovetails into the next question, which is, are there any specific ways that you educate architects, or is it done basically when you get an application for a COA? I think those downtimes would be an opportunity to bring some of those folks in and do a little bit of training and just talk to them about what is the process and help them walk through it so that they understand when they do get a project that may have a historic component, that they're prepared for that. So you can use that downtime for that purpose, if nothing else.
I love the idea of training. We have a training course for contractors, believe it or not. And that was something I did not think they would care anything about. We did it at like 7 a.m. It was 30 or 40 minutes. We were trying to catch them, before they started their day. And it was super well intended, and they attended and they really loved it. And it gave them, it's helped a lot to cut down on unintended violations. And then you could have a realtor course that if it's certified, so they get their continuing ed credits, they will come. Even if they think they don't care about the topic, they might need those credits and they will come.
Same thing with architects. We always need those credits.
That's right. We've done the realtor training.
Yeah.
And APC provides great training. We've used the legal training, which is, and the design guideline training. And as our commission turns over, we need to do that every 2 or 3 years.
I think there's also an opportunity to do even a little bit of a hands-on workshop type stuff, especially when it comes to the actual property owners, because a lot of times they're doing some of this work on their own. Mm-hmm. So showing them how to rehab a window, or even just to fix or repair some exterior wood trim. Because again, that's something that they might not even need to come to you for a COA on, because of the fact that it's a no material change and it's just a repair. But you can teach them how to do it so that they can maintain their buildings and hopefully not even have to come to you for a major repair sometime in the future.
So someone asked, does NAPC have a course outline for contractor training? We do not, but I like the idea. Marie, are you listening? Some historic properties are outside formal districts, and the seller of properties fail to disclose the historic nature of the property. Do you ever work with the title companies to inform them of historic properties?
So that's the program that I was kind of describing in Dubuque, Iowa. They were working actually with the title companies to get it added to the actual titles for the properties. So it would be obvious when you were going to sell or purchase a property that it would be there. I don't know if anybody else has experience with that.
We don't work with the title companies, but we do have an online GIS database that shows the location of any inventoried historic property and also identifies any designations it has, whether it's a local historic district or a National Register listing. And that GIS database is easily accessible to people actually throughout Massachusetts, though we even have a sort of a regional version of it in our area that we expect all of the towns use it regularly. In fact, some of the larger towns even maintain their own GIS database. So it's very easy for people to identify historic properties, and certainly for all of the board and regulatory agencies to know about them too.
And they might be a good one to call on to sponsor the expenses. So they're covering the expenses of the realtor course. That was something West Virginia did when they offered their realtor course. Let's see. Do you have contractors that are approved to work in your historic district, or can any contractor work in your district? And I agree with having a workshop for realtors. We don't mind sitting through a course if we get credit. And it's a lot more fun than a lot of the stuff you have to take as a realtor. So does anyone have certification for contractors? I know Aspen does.
We do not. We have on our website a list of contractors, but it doesn't imply a certification of any sort. Our legal department has told us that we should not be doing that.
The way we do our list is we just say that it's these are people who work in the district regularly.
That's what
but that's it.
So Jane asked, how would you go about getting educational credits for architects? In most cases, it needs to be provided from an approved, accredited education provider through the American Institute of Architects. There's a process to go through for that. If you want to get some training and you want to have it be AIA accredited, there are organizations like NAPC that can actually come in and provide that educational training for you, and they will go through the process of having it as an accredited program. That's why, like the NAPC forum, camps, those are all the courses there typically are accredited for AIA and ICP, because of the fact that that's just what people are going there for, is to get the credits in part. It's a fairly complicated process, so it may not work for everybody, especially some of the smaller communities, but it's something that can be looked at. And I would definitely lean on the larger national or regional organizations to help you out with that.
And this is part of Kendall's question, but she was asking, is there more information about realtor contractor trainings? I'm happy to share what I have. But NAPC also can do a realtor course for you. We've done them Alabama, New York, West Virginia, Tennessee, Alabama. I don't think I'm leaving anyone out. Kentucky. But the trick to that is it's not just a program where we can just come in and like, here's the presentations, because every state is different and every state has different needs in terms of getting it certified. So if that's something you'd like to do with the NAPC, it would really be on that local municipality to take on the responsibility, or the nonprofit or whoever's doing it, to take on the responsibility of getting it certified. And of course, we'll help with that. But getting it certified and reaching out to the realtors, marketing it to the realtors, are two big responsibilities you would take on, because as a national organization, we don't have that information like you do.
And I'll just jump in and suggest that,
Please.
that maybe talk with your statewide nonprofit or your state historic preservation office. I know in Indiana, we've got a couple of different realtor courses that we offer. One on architectural styles, so that everything is not being called a bungalow or a colonial revival in all their listings. Or we have another one on kind of the basics of preservation, so they understand what the difference is between National Register designation versus local historic district designation, and who all the different players are and what they do. So that has been a pretty popular thing. So. But it is through a partnership between the statewide preservation office, and nonprofit, and the state historic preservation office.
Thank you. And Marie, we have another great idea here for solicitor training. What about when your solicitor, your city attorney, is not familiar with HP matters in practice, and they probably don't want to admit that. So let's keep that on the list as well of things to do. What is your technical method for determining the property has changed hands from the county GIS? We have well over 1,000 designated properties to manage, so checking them one at a time on a monthly basis is not realistic, certainly.
Yeah, certainly my districts that I'm dealing with are much smaller, so it's a little easier to keep an eye on things. I would say, maybe check with whoever it is who is running the GIS system for your county or your city, and see if there's a way to flag changes within their system and get those fed to you. But yeah, I'm fortunate that it is a little bit more feasible for me to just kind of look at things manually.
Mm-hmm. We have a voluntary historic preservation ordinance. How can commissions with less teeth and limited staff best advocate for historic preservation in their communities? That is tough. And I don't even know that anyone here, does anyone have experience with commissions that are just that their decisions are just a suggestion?
I don't have anything that's exactly like that, but it's very common in Massachusetts and in our region to have a demolition delay ordinance, which involves the historical commission, and it's a board that can actually place a delay on a request to demolish a historic building, but you can't actually prevent it from happening. The idea is that you use that delay period to see if there are alternatives to demolition, and try to encourage the property owner not to go forward with demolishing the building. So in that case, I mean, it's similar, trying to get attention and for historic preservation and to get people to recognize the significance of preserving these properties. you really need to tackle it from a lot of different angles. And I think it's everything from community education to meeting with your other town boards, whether it's planning boards, selectmen's, other permit granting authorities in your community, and making sure that they know that they can turn to people, either volunteers or to boards in their town that are focused on historic preservation for advice. We have a couple of towns that have actually made sort of agreements, if you will, with the permit granting authorities in their town, that they will automatically communicate with the town historical commission anytime they have a historic building that's impacted by a project that they're reviewing. And that's nice because it means that they automatically get some knowledge at the local level about those properties.
So we have a few more questions here, but in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next segment of the presentation, and then we'll get to these questions hopefully at the end. I think we'll have time. So we've kind of touched on this a little bit as we've been talking about some of the resources that might be available on either the regional or the national level. And we can't forget about those. If you're not familiar with them, every state is divided into administrative regions for the purpose of implementing regional planning and economic development initiatives, mostly organized as regional development organizations, but also as councils of government, regional advisory committees, regional planning commissions, and development districts. These organizations are quasi-governmental bodies that include elected and appointed officials representing the counties and municipalities served by the organization. Each varies greatly on what they have to offer. Sarah, with your experience and with your position, will you tell us what Cape Cod offers?
Sure. So the Cape Cod Commission is the name of the regional planning agency for Cape Cod, which is 15 towns in Massachusetts. And most of our 15 towns are small with limited planning staff. And certainly there are very few that have professional planning staff, professional preservation, historic preservation specialists on staff. So really my job as preservation specialist for the regional planning agency is to support historical commissions and historic district boards in our 15 towns. And we encourage them to reach out to us for technical assistance. And when they have questions about how things work, we're working primarily with volunteers, remember, and there's going to be turnover. And so there's continued educational programs and just support and providing information to these groups.
So when do they typically contact you for that assistance? Is there something specific that kind of triggers that, or is it just kind of on a case-by-case basis?
Well, I would say there's really three main reasons that we get contacted. One is if it's a very complex project. So maybe it's a very large project that has lots of different components, or maybe it's a project that combines partial demolition with new construction and some rehabilitation, and just the plan set is very complex and difficult to interpret. And again, we have to remember that these are volunteers we're talking about. And while some of them may have an architecture background or have experience reading plans, that's certainly not the case for everyone. So that's one reason. I would say also we frequently are asked to jump in if there's very limited information about a historic building. So there's not a whole lot of background or research that's been done that would allow them to really hang their hat or tie their decision to some background information. So we're able in those cases to give a little regional perspective. What's the significance of this property in the bigger picture? And then the last reason is often if a historic board feels that they need more support or strength behind their decision, and this was kind of brought up a little bit earlier, if there's a very politically controversial project, or if it's sort of a first of its kind situation and they really are unsure how to handle it, they don't have any precedent, and they need a little assistance with that. And just as an example, I'd throw out in recent years, because of, so we're coastal communities on the East Coast of Massachusetts, and floodplains and flood impacts have begun to be a much bigger issue. And so we've seen historic buildings that are proposed to be elevated to get them above the base flood elevation. And we've also seen cases where people have thought that they needed to demolish a historic building because it was in the flood zone and they weren't aware really of what their options were for protecting the structure. So several of the towns have reached out for assistance from us in those cases.
When you do provide your technical assistance letter or comments, how do you structure them? What is kind of the makeup of those comments, and how do you get it back to them and express what you actually want to tell them?
Well, we have a basic format that we've been using for quite a while now. And really the idea is to provide the historic boards with the background information that they need to base their decisions on. And while we give recommendations, really, I consider the most important part of the letters to be sort of the laying out of facts for them. And so we start off by identifying whatever kind of historic designation or historic significance that's already been identified for a particular property. Is it on the National Register? Is it in a local district? How big is the district? What's the significance of this particular building within the district? And also then go on to describing the character defining features of this particular structure. What are its most important elements? Why are they significant? And then from there, getting into describing the proposed project. As I said earlier, sometimes it can be tricky to understand exactly what's proposed just looking at the plans and the application materials. Sometimes applicants don't always do themselves a favor by being a little bit unclear in describing the project. And so sometimes boards will need more information about exactly where are new materials being proposed versus where are they actually rehabbing existing materials, things like that. So we get into describing the proposed work and specifically how it impacts those character defining features that we talk about earlier on in the letter. And then finally, we'd sort of end with an assessment of the proposed work and how it impacts the historic significance of the property. And I might make suggestions if it's really obvious that there are some better ways to protect and preserve the key features of the building. And in some cases, we've even gotten into enough detail where we've provided graphic illustrations to help the historical commission members, historic district members really understand what's proposed and what might be a better alternative.
I know that you have a similar program to what Mindy and Laura have, but how is yours different than theirs?
Well, I would say perhaps the difference is that we couldn't possibly help every historic board that had a question in every case, since we have 15 towns and we have multiple boards in some of our towns. So we do have to really encourage towns to contact us when they have a specific case that's more challenging than normal for them. And I think it's important, again, to get back to something we talked about earlier is education. I try to cut that off at the pass a little bit, the need for a lot of assistance from us by occasionally doing training programs in the region where we work with historical commission members from all the towns or from as many as we can get and talk to them about the best way to go through this process. And also working with town staff. We have town staff that are supporting these boards that may not have preservation training, though they're certainly capable of providing great assistance. And so helping them to understand what they can be looking for can be really helpful. And I think there's also other folks we can be reaching out to. I should mention that Massachusetts has a statewide nonprofit called Preservation Mass that also has a circuit rider program very similar to Laura's. And And I will say they only have a few circuit riders that are trying to cover the entire state, but they managed to step in and do a lot of work. And so I think we sort of have an unwritten agreement with them that if one of us is involved in a case and the other one doesn't need to be, unless it's really super important.
Makes sense. Robin, do you think we're ready to try and tackle some of these other questions that have popped up?
Yeah, I think these questions are really for everybody. So I think we can just open this up to whoever wants to jump in.
Sounds good. I'm going to start with the one that's at the top because I think there were a couple people that were interested in that one. Do you ever assist property owners with seeking grants for rehabilitation work, particularly for commercial properties where building code compliance, accessibility, or infrastructure improvements may be required or necessary? Anybody have input on that one?
I would say being, with the statewide, preservation organization, in any conversation, if it was a nonprofit, we talk about the Keystone grant that they might be eligible for. If it's a commercial property, we always suggest that they consider tax credits because they're already, while that's obviously a little more restrictive because it's the interior too, we say you're already doing this for the outside, so why not consider it? And in a community as small as Mercersburg is, it's not really resulted in a number of tax credit projects, but there have been a few, and I think it's because they weren't even aware of it. So making that recommendation, because the local review district and the National Register district are the same boundaries, nobody really understands why they're eligible, which is fine. We'd rather have them, sort of take that on to the next, to do a tax credit.
For a voluntary board, Sarah suggests focus on non-regulatory ways to recognize sites important to the community. I think this is a good one. Maybe you can launch a marker program or some other type of recognition. Leading with a non-regulatory approach may help garner support for preservation overall and pave the way for more regulatory actions later on. Nice, thank you. That was helpful. Do any of your communities list historic district status on the transfer to a new buyer?
Doesn't look like it.
Yeah,
Getting a lot of head shaking no.
And Patricia in the chat, I wanted to add this. She said that in her community, and I think this is probably the case for most, that real estate transfers are listed in the paper. So that may be another way to find out when property has changed hands.
We did get a question from Peter. His question, and it's a great question, I think a lot of people ask all the time, is why don't commissions simply read the National Register criteria and the Secretary of the Interior standards? I don't even think that's a question, but it's a comment that's worth sharing.
And hopefully they are in their guidelines.
Yeah. Well, and hopefully if they have guidelines, and they've had somebody come in and help them put those guidelines together, those guidelines are based on and include some of that information so that it's carried forward and everybody kind of gets access to it and sees it.
Stephen Nitz has a good comment too. Speak about economic advantages, please. This would help us sell it locally. And I completely agree. We were fortunate enough to be able to raise the money to hire a consultant come in and do a Nashville study. And we use it all the time. And it really revealed some surprising things, but it's helpful when we're going to council, when we're going to the mayor's office, when we're talking to people whose business is money, right? To be able to talk about what a difference preservation makes economically.
And I will mention also, one benefit that we have found and has been really valuable down here for having a working with the CAP program and having a preservation professional on staff is we've been able to get certified local government status in one of my communities, and we're working on it in another. And then therefore those communities are being able to go after to grants and have tangible results from rehab projects and survey and things like that they would not be necessarily eligible for otherwise, since they wouldn't meet the criteria for having professional staff on board to get that CLG designation. So
I was just going to say, going back to the previous question, I'm assuming everyone does this, but when I do my preliminary review sheet that goes to the applicant and to the board, I do list the applicable local guidelines and it keeps me pretty aware of Secretary of Interior standards because I have to choose which ones. But I think it's important because when you make that motion to approve or not approve, it's really good to refer to because it doesn't meet the standards or because it doesn't meet the guidelines. And I think that really helps, especially applicants who come back a second time or a third time, understand what it's all about. In a small community, it's just as likely that if you saw there was a ladder in front of your house and the police officer drove by, he'd say, "Hey, did you go through HARB for that?" I mean, which is, and they just know they have to do it. I don't think they have any real understanding of what it is. And so I think it's good to be, at least through their process, even if it's for a simple new sign or a change of a front door, that they understand that when they come before the HARB, why it is they're there.
I think going back to our earlier discussion about everybody in the town knowing everybody, so the commissioners know everybody. If you want your decisions to not be arbitrary and capricious, you put those specific how it doesn't meet the Secretary of Interior standards. You don't even have to have local guidelines. If you have the National Register criteria and the Secretary of Interior standards, you can quote those or cite certain aspects or passages in both of those documents to kind of back up your decision. So it's not just, I don't like my neighbor, so I'm voting against their project. It's, I'm voting against their project because of these reasons. And it gives you that backstop that keeps it from being something that somebody come back and criticize you for later, especially when you don't have staff.
Virginia asked, how can I get access to the economic studies to help with convincing those in doubt the economic value of preservation in our small historic districts for all citizens? And others may have other ideas, but just Google preservation studies or economic studies, and there's just a host of them. Do you guys have other ideas?
Say, if you're lucky, your state has actually done an analysis in that state, which is going to be a lot easier to use as a model to convince your local legislators or whoever you need to convince.
I actually got an email from the National Trust today that had a link in it to a state-by-state analysis of how the historic tax credits benefited the state from a tax-based standpoint. So you really put the economic numbers to it. So kind of to Robin's point, I would go to the National Trust website and look for some of the reports. The Preservation Green Lab had a really good report several years ago that went through how much impact historic preservation projects had on a community when you rehabbed a building versus tear it down and build new. Donovan Ripkema and Place Economics has a lot of great statistics and reports that they've done as well. So do a little Google search, you'll find a lot of that information. If you don't find it, reach out to NAPC. They can direct you where to go to find some of that information as well.
And there were several in the Q&A saying Ripkema, Place Economics. That's his company.
If you don't know that name, you will.
And you will love it.
Yes.
You go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, Mark asked a question. Do you review local preservation code and offer suggestions on updating language when necessary as a consultant or as a regional authority?
Yes, definitely. I mean, we get a wide range of questions, and I would say updating guideline or developing design guidelines, updating language to make it stronger those are common things. I've actually worked with a couple communities in our region also to adopt new bylaws that are historic preservation incentive bylaws. So there's a lot of benefit to working as part of a planning staff, at my regional agency, because we have folks who are experts in zoning, experts in other areas, natural resources, whatever might be of concern in your neighborhood, in addition to the preservation of historic properties. And And it's good to be to have a strong team to work with if you're doing any kind of updating of regulations.
I would assume for those of you that work kind of in a more statewide situation, some of those comments end up being catered a little bit more towards the communities that you're dealing with, whether they're in a certain part of the state where it's more rural or more residential versus more commercial. I'm assuming there's some change in how you might recommend some of those changes to them.
Yeah, I would say so. I'm trying to think about the 4 communities that I work with, and yeah, each of them is a little bit different. But we do, Indiana Landmarks in the past kind of developed a model ordinance that we have provided to a lot of communities statewide. So many of the communities have kind of based their language on that, as well as the statewide enabling legislation. So there is actually quite a bit of similarities between the ordinances in the various communities that I work with.
That's good. Got to make it a little easier for you.
Yes, it does.
And I've seen several states do that have that draft ordinance that others can use. Jill asked, how do you handle demolition by neglect? That's a big question.
That's the easiest question we'll have today.
Yeah, that is definitely a challenge. It kind of bridges the gap a little bit between the advocacy role of landmarks and then also the role of a staff to the commission. In the staff to the commission role, I'm more, bringing the findings and the situations to the attention of the city building commissioner or the city attorney who is going to do the actual enforcement. Whereas, landmarks as an entity can maybe kind of work more behind the scenes to find a solution for these buildings to allow them to be preserved. Working with the property owners or working with the local nonprofit or whatever to try to find a good solution for these buildings.
So I'm wondering, like Mindy,
I was just going to say that I see that the local commission certainly cares about that, but I really feel like the enforcement has to be with the municipality, with codes. Not every municipality has has demolition by neglect or minimum maintenance standards, but if you do, that's the way it really has to be handled, I think, rather than from what is generally a volunteer board saying you can't let that happen.
Yeah, I was wondering, that's what I was going to ask you, Mindy, as a consultant who consults to these smaller communities who don't have staff. Let's say a commissioner or even just somebody in the community brings to a commissioner's attention a building that's being neglected and that they're concerned about it. Do you have the situation where then they come to you and say, how should we handle that? And can you help us draft something that can go to that property owner and alert them to the fact that it's been noticed? Do you ever have that type of thing happen?
Yeah, occasionally, not so much with the municipality I've been referring to, but just as part of our role as advocacy. I mean, we try to find examples. We try to connect them with someone who's done it just so that they can feel comfortable. We'll review a letter if they want us to before they send it. But, we are very clear. I mean, this is another topic we're not talking about today, but, we lose more buildings because of zoning issues than we do because of historic review commissions. And so, we always try to be really clear when people call us and say, there's a Dollar General coming and they're going to tear down this building, that it's not something that the local commission can really do. I mean, the fact that it's allowed, it was not included in any kind, it's not, demolishing it and building it was allowed within zoning. It puts them in a really awkward position, and you don't want your commission and your zoning hearing board and your council all at odds over this. So we try to be really clear about what the role is of a volunteer board, because they do, all of their decisions are are just recommending to the borough council. So, we just try not to overstep our bounds in a volunteer capacity or a recommending capacity.
I know that some have a formal ordinance to deal with this. Raleigh, North Carolina's is really, really good. We don't, but we do have strong neighborhood organizations. And so they kind of take on that role so that we're not just randomly hitting people up, but we're really going after properties that the neighborhood really cares about and is really concerned about. And we even had one where they were going into the building because it wasn't fully secure and finding old mail to try to find out who to contact. Because that's sometimes the hardest thing, especially if someone dies and there's multiple children and you don't have someone you could call. So that's been helpful for us. I don't know if others want to take that on or if we should move on. Sarah, you looked like maybe you were going to add something. Am I wrong? Or?
I think it's just a challenging topic. I don't have an answer really above what's been discussed already, but I will say that many of our communities are looking at minimum maintenance standards now because they have had cases like this. And I guess I just think it's worth noting that when you have a very visible case like this, it could be your opportunity to get the kind of support you need to adopt a new ordinance that addresses that issue. So try to take advantage of any momentum you might have.
The next question is, we have a very high real estate values here in Santa Cruz, California. I bet you do. How do you address, I know you do because everyone from California is leaving there and coming here. How do you address demolition by neglect and those wanting to get delisted to do what they want? So it's kind of the same as what we've been talking about. I know for us, the delisting part of the question, we just try not to. We have not yet had a council member who would support the delisting, and so it hasn't happened for us yet. Have you guys had any discussions about delisting?
That's good to hear.
Yeah. I'll take the next one too. And then Chris, you take it. Often owners of designated homes do not realize they should work with preservation architects or architects at all when doing a renovation. Their budget does not include this. Does anyone have a solution to this? Perhaps persuading local architects to be willing to create drawings at a reasonable price for the commission to review. That's probably not going to happen. One of the commissioners on my HBC has actually jumped into the weeds to do drawings for a project, which of course is a no-no. Thanks for adding that part.
I think it's a tough one because, depending on the size of your community, there just may not be a lot of preservation architects or architects with that experience nearby. So I think the more important thing is to jump out and give them education about, why this building is important, why the historic district is valuable to the community. Somebody mentioned economic benefits earlier. There's just a lot of pieces to that puzzle of why we care for historic structures and why we pursue historic preservation. So I just encourage you to get involved in that.
So we were talking about economic studies, et cetera, about the value of historic preservation. Peter pointed out that there's a Rutgers study about that with national numbers, and that the person who did that is also doing one for Route 66 currently. Someone else had asked where to go to find some of these economic studies. One place that you can look is on, as I said before, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The website for that to start with is forum.savingplaces.org. And I found a number of the economic studies under /learn/fundamentals/economics. So again, if you Google, historic preservation and economics or economic viability, you'll probably come up with some great resources that way.
And Chris, Sarah, and Miami-Dade, she posted a link to theirs in the Q&A.
Awesome. Go ahead, Robin, if you got another question to go to.
Let's see. Does anyone have model ordinances for commissions overlays that's strong and defendable in court? Again, I know a lot of states do that. Have you guys seen anyone in particular you thought was really good or feel like yours is really good? Laura, you probably feel like yours is pretty good.
Yes, I do, but it's definitely specific to the enabling legislation here in the state of Indiana. So you would want to be sure that whatever you're looking at adopting in your community is consistent with your state's enabling legislation, which kind of lays out the framework for how a preservation commission can be established.
Which is why your state historic preservation office may be the first place to go. They may already have one.
So Sarah's link to that Miami-Dade economic study is www.miamidade.gov/planning/library/historic preservation, historic-preservation. You can find it in there. So if you're looking for that one. Alex asked, if a city's historic inventory has the majority of the structure's original elevation drawings, isn't this the essential groundwork and foundation for creating and codifying a preservation guidelines book? As in, any changes to windows, doors, etc., facade need not stray from the original drawing. Would everyone agree with that statement?
No.
No. I was going to say,
we don't have it. That doesn't really exist. I mean, I think a lot of times people think that, the city has building permits for all these historic buildings, but they didn't. Or if they did get a building permit back in the day, it was just like, you have a permit. There's no drawings.
I think this is where the historic surveys come in, because at least those are a marker in time when that survey was done on what was there, what it looked like, and generally it will assess, is the property contributing property to the neighborhood or not, et cetera, and kind of identify some of the character defining features. That becomes your guideline.
Our ordinance is a demolition delay ordinance of 6 months. Are there any successful strategies or outcomes you can point to?
Well, I talked about demolition delay a little bit earlier, and I think the first thing I'd recommend is that you try to get a longer delay than 6 months. I think the longer time period you have, the greater disincentive you have to pursuing demolition, and also the more time you have to actually work with someone to consider an alternative. Many of the towns that I work with have a 12-month delay. Some even have an 18-month delay. And I say the ones that have actually had the greatest success are the ones with the longest delays. But I will just throw out, one thing I mentioned a little bit earlier is if you have the ability to reach out to either a consultant or a preservation specialist at a regional agency, or essentially what we're trying to market to you or suggest to you is useful today. It can be really helpful to have a professional who can help you really argue in favor of an alternative to demolition, whether it's sitting down and talking to the applicant's architect about alternatives, or developing just some illustrations that would show how different a property might look if it weren't there, if it were replaced with something new. So if you have access to that kind of illustrations that, picture tells 1,000 words, that those can be really helpful, we've found.
Sarah, do you find that the delay actually results in a positive outcome? What I've found in the past is the delay is just a delay, and all it does is kick the can down the road, and they still demolish the building at the end of the delay.
Well, that definitely happens, Chris. Though I would say, there's always been a percentage of buildings that end up not getting demolished under the delay. And it may be as low as, 10% success stories, but to me, that's still significant. We've got a couple of buildings that where the property owners just, for some reason, were not aware that their property was historically significant. And once they actually had a conversation with the local board and understood the bigger picture, oftentimes these are people who might have purchased the property after not having spent a lot of time in the area. then they actually have changed their mind and gone forward with a renovation or a partial renovation project. And then we have other cases where just bringing the proposal into the public eye more, whether it's in local newspapers or just by spreading the word through the town website, they have found that there were people in the community who were interested in the property that's proposed for demolition, and they've actually ended up selling the property to the folks who wanted to rehab it rather than have it be demolished. So I do think it's worth the effort, and you can probably or boards can probably tell those cases when it's worth putting in that extra time.
Well, let's hope that's the outcome we usually get. I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. We were running out of time. If we didn't get to your question, please do not hesitate to reach out to the presenters as my train goes by.
There's your train.
I told you I would have one. Presenters via email. You can find their contact information with their bios in the handouts tab, if you can still hear me. NAPC will continue to offer webinars like these at no cost to NAPC members. If you're not already a member, we encourage you to join so you too can get free access to ongoing virtual training opportunities, among the many other great NAPC member benefits. All attendees of today's live session will automatically receive a certificate of completion via email later this afternoon. If you do not see it by Monday morning, please be sure to check your spam and promotions folder. Thank you so much, and thank you again to Sarah, Laura, Mindy, and Tim. On behalf of Robin and myself and NAPC, we hope you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.